Welcome to Supply Chain Signal, a pharmaceutical commerce production in which we cut through the noise in the regulatory and industry developments reshaping pharma's supply chain and break down what actually matters for the people running these operations. My name is Steve Appizato, editor on pharmaceutical commerce, and joining me today is pharmaceutical supply chain expert Dr. Thanigavelan Jambulingam to help us unpack the policy, trade, and market dynamics shaping the industry's supply chains. Thani, thanks for being here. Before we dive in, can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. I'm Dr. Thani Jambulingam. I'm a professor at St. Joseph's University in the Department of Food, Pharma, and Healthcare.
Let's get into today's episode. In the latest in the domestic supply chain resiliency and reshoring efforts, the FDA has launched a new pilot program aimed at getting pharmaceutical manufacturing built on U.S. soil faster. That's our lead story today. We'll also get into two shorter items worth having on your radar. Recently, the FDA named its first PreCheck Pilot Cohort. So what is PreCheck? It launched February 1st under an executive order signed by the President in May 2025 to strengthen the domestic drug supply chain and manufacturing. According to the FDA, it enhances industry engagement by facilitating earlier interactions to minimize uncertainty that's often associated with manufacturing readiness, so problems don't get caught late after the money's spent. PreCheck is designed to move scrutiny earlier, allowing the FDA to identify potential facility issues before they result in deficiencies that could delay or prevent application approval. FDA had more than 80 applicants for just 7 initial spots, evaluated on what they manufacture, how far along construction was, and how much manufacturing innovation the project brought. So Thani, what's the bottom line? Companies have already been facing tariff pressure to build domestically. So what are the supply chain implications of this? And does an actual regulatory incentive like this move the needle more than tariffs have?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. In supply chain, when I do research in that space, we think about power and how regulators can use different types of power, So one of them is, reward. You can reward them for behavior that the government likes them to do. So this would fall under regulatory incentives, a behavior where you want them to do the thing that would benefit the country, right? So that's one approach. If you think about tariff, that's a coercion. It's a punishment model. It's a kind of a negative incentive. So if you don't do this, I would do that, right? So it's kind of a different use of power. So this would fall under, a reward mechanism. Also, the FDA being an expert and have the legitimacy to do that. Actually, there are other sources of power. So it's combination of reward, legitimacy, and also, to some extent, expert, saying we will help you to streamline the process of approving the manufacturing. So that way you could reduce the time and the cost to get it operational in US. And so that's the kind of the objective, I would say, with this particular policy. And I would call this more like an industrial policy. The government wanted more, focus on bringing manufacturing to US as a core competency and a competitive advantage moving forward. Having our experience going through COVID, we went through a risk in our supply chain. So the cost model, right? The efficiency model, that's how supply chain works. The cost, wherever it's low, it's going to be made globally. If at all we can sustain supply chain. But we learned that under crisis, that's very difficult to achieve. So we have moved from efficiency model to a resilience model. So the resilience model requires commitments from the government, from the companies in order to make it work. So this is a good initiative. provided it pays off in the long run. It can definitely increase regulatory certainty. It can improve domestic, capacity. My insight would be that it is very valuable for high-value biologics, sterile injectables for sure, and advanced manufacturing, and also some shortage-sensitive products. But I don't see a big impact on APIs and also generics because they are very cost driven, and unless the incentives to make it happen here at a higher cost because US manufacturing is more expensive, it would be very difficult for them to migrate to US. Possibly it can increase inventory, but FDA has clearly stated that this PreCheck process is no guarantee that there will be expedited product approval or inspection outcomes. So they're not guaranteeing anything, right? So the inventory is, why would companies create more inventory? Okay, what's the value of that? Because it adds cost to them. If it is sitting in the warehouse, it adds cost to the companies, right? So the companies always look at, if we build inventory, how can that be used in the marketplace? The more inventory they can create, but there should be more demand for the product. So it comes down to economics, right? It's economics. So which means there should be certain level of API sourcing. We should be able to, because in order to build that inventory, they need to consider the API sourcing to make we have enough products that we could, bring it here to get to the finished goods, finished project. We need labor, we need more labor, skilled labor, right? This is not any labor. So it is skilled labor, and we need to hire, train, and get them up to speed, especially in the biological space and other areas. We need procurement contracts, continue to have contracts so we could not have any slowdown in the process. We need good reimbursement for these products. At the end of the day, only if there is good reimbursement, the product would be used in the marketplace. Companies need working capital in order to build this infrastructure ready to roll. There is quality issues that companies have to deal with, and demand certainty. All these are factors that enable the product to be used in the marketplace. So building inventory should not be the end goal. It should be, how can we keep the demand sustainable so that this manufacturing, would be able to deliver that to the companies. So that's something that we need to think about. So it's more important to consider that these processes are building strategic infrastructure for the industry. So hopefully that pays out.
So moving from onshoring to a story on the pricing and tariff side, recently the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative opened a Section 301 investigation into Germany. According to the USTR, the investigation relates to allegations of Germany's unfair pricing policies and practices with regard to innovative pharmaceutical products, which result in the United States paying a disproportionate share of global research and development costs for innovative pharmaceuticals. The German legislation in question was passed by their parliament just this week and is a sweeping cost containment measure designed to reduce pressure on public finances. It introduced a range of changes, including higher discounts for insurance funds from the drug industry, prompting numerous drug makers to warn that they might withdraw or delay new medicines in the country. The USTR was explicit about the template it wants Germany to follow. The US-UK pharmaceutical pricing arrangement from April, where the UK agreed to raise medicine spending in exchange for tariff-free access to the US market. Germany, in the USTR's words, should follow suit. So Thani, what is your take on this? Does this mark a shift toward the US using trade law as its primary lever on international drug pricing disputes?
I think here the issue is, in fact, related to the first one we talked about, the FDA incentives to increase domestic manufacturing. And that is that the economics of companies, on one end, focusing on reducing cost of manufacturing, the other end, they also wanted to protect pricing. So if you think about pricing, one of the big changes that's been happening is the most favorite nations pricing, which means that we would look at other countries and what they are pricing, mostly in the developed parts of the world, and take that price as an input to what the price negotiation would be in the US. So think about that for a moment. If those reference prices, for example, the German reference price that potentially could be used in the situation, might, if that price drops, so your reference price suddenly becomes lower, that would initiate that the US negotiated price might be lower too. So that affects the margins of these companies, right? Before, we never reference others, right? We don't reference others. It's market-based, value-based pricing for the US market. So now with this new kind of change in policy, now you're being asked to reference. So two things from a government standpoint and from the company standpoint. The government standpoint is we are already subsidizing drug development costs globally. We put a lot more money in developing the drugs in the US, and then other countries can pick and choose what they want with respect to how much they would be willing to pay. For example, in Germany, they would have their own price negotiation on these new drugs. Second, they would use health technology assessment in deciding whether they would cover the drug or not, okay? And then force companies to reduce prices. And I understand why Germany is doing this, right? The Germany is doing that because they want to make it affordable, given its publicly paid benefit. Healthcare and pharmaceuticals are public benefit. And so they're trying to manage their costs in order to reduce that. And so they want to afford more than what they are currently possible. And so they're trying to reduce that. The counter argument would be that, we are already subsidizing the cost. Now, if you do more of that, we would be ending up paying more for innovation. So who would actually be helping us to share that innovation cost? So that's the appeal, right? And so we'll see how that pans out. But it comes down to two things. One is our supply, our ability to continue to innovate. And it comes down to how much the world is willing to share. Okay, and so how do you balance that? I understand what Germany is doing. We talked about that. But then also, US needs to know, who is willing to share that innovation. And then on top of that, who is going to foot the bill for innovation here? So we'll see how that pays out. But I think it's a very important question. Should other countries change their policy to the point that we got to take more and more on the cost of the drugs?
And our last item for today, CMS recently proposed converting the Medicare drug price negotiation program from a year-to-year guidance into a permanent regulation starting with the 2029 negotiation cycle, covering up to 20 drugs per cycle across both Part B and Part D. The proposal also narrows a policy some manufacturers have used to keep a reformulated product from being aggregated with the original for selection purposes, effectively closing a pathway some companies have used to avoid negotiation eligibility. That's particularly relevant for a combination of products in cardiovascular, renal, metabolic, and obesity categories. The comment period runs through August 17th. So Tani, what's your take on this? Does codifying this into permanent regulation actually change manufacturer behavior, or does it just formalize what companies were already planning around?
I think it is a change in policy from negotiation as a tool to be used when necessary to make it to a permanent process. So that is a shift in the policy of controlling costs, right, from the government perspective. Fully understandable that the government increasingly has become bigger and bigger payer with respect to Medicare and Medicaid, with the state and federal funding as well. So there is a need for the government to look at cost as a way to reduce the prices on these products or find a way to control how much spending we can control. So this shift that the formulational change cannot really use that as a modality to continue to separate that from the single molecule status is coming, because in the past we have seen companies use those strategies for line extension, and it could be used for other kind of marginal modification to the product as a way to continue to generate revenue around them. I think government wanted to put an end to that. They want to say, hey, unless the product that you're bringing to the market has significant clinical differentiation or new indication where the product could be used or meaningful outcomes improvement, you can't continue to use that as a strategy to continue to manage your product that way. I mean, you're kind of constantly keep that away from negotiation, right? So the companies have to change their mindset. Now, I think this one is up for review, I guess, right? I mean, it's going to be reviewed, and there are going to be public input and all that stuff coming. But I think the critical part is the companies have to consider how they, manage the life cycle of their product. If assuming in the past it used to be, okay, we'll develop one product with one indication, and then we continue to expand that product through different types of additional indication and different types of dosing and different types of delivery forms. Now they got to be very clear about what their development or life cycle management strategy would be, okay, that they are to do that. Also, they need to consider what product to move forward and what product not to move forward from a portfolio management standpoint. So that would be implications on the companies as well. So it is kind of a strategy by CMS to force companies to not too much on the incremental innovation, but focus on really significant innovation moving forward. And also, how do you value these companies because of this change in policy? What would be the valuation models looking like? So those things have to be considered as well from a company standpoint. So I think a key point that you got to remember is that it's great that lowering prices by negotiation is a great step forward, but lowering prices by itself doesn't translate to access, because access has a lot more steps involved, right? So if you're using a Medicare program that's been administered by a third-party insurance company, right, through the Advantage program or whatever you're using, you're still going to go through prior authorization, co-insurances, step edits, formulary restrictions, specialty pharmacy, barriers, all that going to be there. And that's not going to disappear. So it doesn't mean automatically it increases patient access. So one has to be careful about, okay, this is good first step to think about pricing. How does that translate to access? So that's what CMS should be thinking about. So we'll see how shapes forward. And you can see a convergence. All of these are kind of linked to each other, right? How do we increase access? How can we motivate and incentivize companies to invest in US? How can we create some level of protection or security for our supply chain, improve our resilience? All these policies are related. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
That's it for this month's installment of Supply Chain Signal. Stay tuned for our next episode in which we analyze the latest regulatory and industry trends reshaping the pharmaceutical supply chain.